Paris is in flames. The citizens of the City of Lights are at arms in the streets filled with barricades. The windows of the Hôtel de Ville are smashed with slung stones, and the very life of the king is under threat. The year is 1648. Not for the first time or the last time in the turbulent history of the French state, the people of the city are at the throat of their own government, but not for abstractions like the rights of man. Instead, these slingers, the frondeurs, smashed windows and burned houses in anger against the weight of new taxes and the oppression of overpowerful officials. These riots and protests started as only the angry shaking of a lower-class fist against the money-hungry royal officials. But they created an opening in the system of French government which power-hungry noblemen and jealous bureaucrats would happily exploit for their own benefit. King Louis XIV was only 10 years old in 1648. After his mother's long-troubled marriage with his father Louis XIII, the French court had been in tension for many years before the young king's birth, worried that without a direct male heir, the powerful but frequently contested throne of France would be left once more as the grand prize in an endless military contest between noble claimants. When at last Louis begat Louis, the jubilation was so intense that the newborn was acclaimed with the name Dieudonné, the God-given, and the news was greeted with great celebration across France. It was only 4.5 years between Louis's birth and the death of his father, making the God-given boy King of France. Yet in the 6 short years between his unwitting ascension and the year 1648, the mood of the country felt a complete change. War, punishing taxes, and tyrannical officials had soured the feeling of the French people, and the government became very unpopular. Not long after, the young king's crown, his privacy, even his life would be under threat. This is what happened. Louis XIII, father of the young King Louis, had a similarly tumultuous youth, full of rebellions and spats with the Protestant minorities. A secretive and somewhat vindictive man, Louis XIII ruled mostly through the use of ministers, most famously Cardinal Richelieu, whom he placed at the head of the fledgling French bureaucracy, and largely depended upon for policy decisions. This autocratic character of the monarchy was shaped by centuries of struggle over whether the king had the final say in the French government, or was merely the most powerful of the noblemen. Centuries of warfare had seen the French royal domain shrink to an all-time low around the time of Hugh Capet in the 10th century, and gradually regrow into the much more substantial personal holdings and power of Francis I, when Renaissance France was arguably at its height.
Don't be saucy with me, Bernays.
The tensions present in French society due to the fractures created during the Protestant Reformation caused constant provocations from both sides, eventually erupting into the French Wars of Religion, a decades-long conflict for the soul of France, where various noble parties battled for control over the throne in ploys of assassination, coup, and rebellion, until at last Henry of Navarre became King of France by defecting from the Protestant faith in order to assume the crown, famously stating that Paris is worth a mass. Henry of Navarre, or Henry IV of France, was known for being a wise and temperate ruler who exercised royal power with restraint, ending religious conflict in the country by pronouncing the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed the freedom of worship for French Protestants, or Huguenots as they were known. His heir, Louis XIII, attempted through long years of struggle to cement his personal claim to the throne, and the throne's claim to complete authority over France, and his use of clerics like Richelieu or professional bureaucrats recruited from the lower classes as ministers was intended to help the king escape the need to rely on rebellious vassal lords to get things done. With the death of both the elder Louis and the elder statesman Richelieu, the government was left in the hands of the Queen Mother, Louis XIII's Austrian bride Anne, and Richelieu's Italian protégé, Cardinal Mazarin. Gaston of Orléans and a couple of other French princes were also thrown into the mix for the Regency Council. Anne and Mazarin were both eminently competent, level-headed regents, but they had their problems. They were both foreigners, and to the proud and self-conscious French, immediately suspect, and in Mazarin's case, fabulously, overwhelmingly corrupt. Mazarin was notorious for his addiction to gambling, and, like Richelieu before him, enjoyed patronizing the arts on the back of his cut of the national treasury. It was also alleged, with a reasonable basis in circumstances, that he and the Queen were lovers. These traits did not make the two of them very popular. Additionally, the other members of the Regency Council were potential claimants to power themselves. Gaston of Orléans was only a generation removed from the royal household. Worse yet, the 1640s were a decade full of suffering set amidst a century of nearly continual crisis. It was at this time that the little Middle Ice Age was at its deepest. Crop failure struck year after year. Richelieu had involved the kingdom in the immensely bloody 30 Years' War, which, though it ended in 1648, also meant at the same time a war with Spain, which was a continual drain on the French treasury, and would remain a painful cancer eating at the royal finances for years. To top it all off, in order to raise funds to continue these wars and to run the government, the Kingdom of France had as its main method of generating revenue an absurdly inefficient method of tax farming, carried out by the so-called partisans, professionals who intentionally bid down the amount of tax revenue they would give back to the government, while squeezing the French peasantry and lower nobility with a shameless rapacity, which constantly led to riots, duels, rebellions, and disturbances in the provinces. On January 18, 1648, these simmering tensions would finally reach a head. Struggling to pay for the ongoing war, the Regency Council decreed new taxes, which they forced the Parliament of Paris to acknowledge with the presence of the young king. The hostility of the crowd must have been palpable. The 10-year-old King Louis forgot his words in the midst of his speech and began to cry. One of his regents was forced to finish it for him. There were no acclamations of Vive le Roi. From the very outset, the literate classes of Paris were outraged, and the Parliament refused to acknowledge the new taxes. Judges from the Parliament condemned Mazarin as a tyrant and proclaimed that the truest way to serve the king would be in disobedience. Others said that the regents were destroying the foundations of the monarchy by interposing themselves in the middle of the sacred bond between monarch and subjects. Just why did the members of the Parliament feel empowered to make these kinds of declarations? You see, it was Paris itself, in the form of the Parliament of Paris, which announced to Henry of Navarre, that peace-bringing king who left the Protestant faith to assume the throne 3 generations ago, that the Parliament would not accept him as king unless he became Catholic. It was the city and the people, or at least the nobles, of Paris, who had forced conditions on the king, and they could claim it was for the good of the Catholic religion and for the peace of the whole kingdom, in this way making their claim to be the legitimate government of France. The parliaments of France are unique bodies, and there were many of them around the kingdom with varying levels of authority. They were high courts, they were recorders of traditional law, and they had the power to make protests against royal edicts. They were not a representative body like the English Parliament, neither did they have the power to levy taxes, something which belonged to another organization called the Estates General. Unlike either of these, the parliaments were not called or dismissed by anyone, even the king, and the Parliament of Paris was the most prestigious and the most powerful of them all. By May, opinions had solidified, and the Parliament of Paris reached out to the parliaments of the provinces for support. In an unprecedented move, these courts united to attempt to compel the Regency and the king to submit to their own power. In June, the parliaments formed an assembly, the so-called Chamber of St. Louis, and began to issue formal demands. The chamber declared of its own authority that taxes were to be reduced, that nobody should be held without trial for longer than 24 hours, and that the practice of tax farming was to be totally outlawed. Queen Anne was outraged, and the other regents feared how the situation might develop. The Queen accused the parliaments of attempting to foment a revolution and to create a republic, a threat made more poignant by the ongoing presence of the deposed heir to the English throne, Charles, Prince of Wales, who had fled the land of his birth 2 years before at the conclusion of the English Civil War. The city of Naples, too, had risen against its Spanish rulers just the year before, and the leader of this short-lived revolution had, in fact, declared a republic, a possibility rendered into an ominous threat by Parisian citizens sometimes heard to cry, "À Naples," to Naples. Gaston, the Duke of Orleans, and one of Anne's co-regents, was known to be a good public speaker, and he appeared before the chamber to make excuses and to buy time. A few concessions were accepted by the Queen, and the Chamber of St. Louis was permitted to go on meeting. The much-loathed institution of the intendants, chief royal officials to the provinces with near dictatorial powers, were at last abolished, but the peace was not to last. August 26th was the day after the Feast of St. Louis, patron of the royal house, and the day of celebration for a recent victory over a Spanish army. While a Te Deum was being sung in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, under order of the Queen, 6 royal guardsmen entered and arrested the 2 leading members of the Parliament of Paris to take them away to prison in the Channel Coast port of Le Havre. Paris erupted into violence. In a matter of days, over 1,000 barricades would spring up in the streets of the city, and as many as 50,000 people are estimated to have borne arms against the government. Once again, as in prior such riots, the royal guard was rendered impotent, and was incapable of securing the palace against the mob or even of occupying it. The court was paralyzed with fear. For a brief time, the parliaments reigned supreme, even installing one of the arrested parliamentarians as an advisor to the king. It was during this period that a great number of satirical pamphlets began to be printed in the city of Paris, as many as 5,000 different editions over the next 4 years, all dedicated to attacking the unpopular Mazarin with broad-ranging accusations. The supposition of one that he fornicated with the queen did not stop another from alleging that he was a homosexual who, to paraphrase, was having his way with the state. By October 22nd, the queen was close to complete capitulation, conceding to further tax cuts and control of the chamber over royal appointments. Anne was compelled to explain away her weakness to her fellow regents Gaston of Orleans and the Prince of Condé, that she agreed to such conditions only under duress. The interior situation was so tense that Mazarin frustratedly complained his signing of the Peace of Westphalia, finally concluding the 30 Years' War, had been completely ignored, though he had failed to make a similar peace with Spain, leaving that war to drag on. This peace had one principal advantage for the royal court, which is that it released the army from marching around in Germany burning villages and pillaging the Rhineland generally, and permitted them to finally use the troops to restore some semblance of order in the capital. But the parliaments were not going to take military intervention lying down. Moving beyond usual legislation and judgment about taxes, the chamber went as far as to forbid the army to approach any closer to Paris than about 20 leagues, or 50 miles. The court thus had a potential source of power waiting in the countryside, but no way to get it to the capital without arousing suspicion. The queen decided that her only option was to run for it. On the night of the 5th of January, 1649, during the citywide celebrations of the Feast of the Epiphany, the queen, noted as being in unusually high spirits, absconded with the young king, his brother, and a small group of courtiers, and fled the city. As the city of Paris woke up kingless the next morning, the parliamentary faction refused to be daunted. By now, many of the nobles living in the city had also joined arms with the parliament, and acting together they seized the imposing royal arsenal of the Bastille. If the regents would try to use the army to put down the parliament would meet them on the field with its own force. The stage seemed set for civil war. The French armies in the north at this time were commanded by the young Prince Condé, Louis de Bourbon, then only 28. Fresh from victories against imperial and Spanish forces during the 30 Years' War, he was the most famous French commander of his generation, and it was on this famous lord's service that Queen Anne and the young Louis were to depend for stopping the rebellion. At the direction of the regents and under the banner of the king, the great Condé surrounded Paris and besieged the city. Meanwhile, in the city, the solidarity between the parliamentarians and the citizens was remarkably solid, to the point that there were no eruptions of looting or civic violence, unless the target was one who happened to wear a royal badge. In spite of the protestations of loyalty to the king, even the royal coat of arms made one suspect. Nevertheless, as time wore on, the hungry populace could not withstand siege, and the high hopes formed from seizing the Bastille never materialized into an army. The court, meanwhile, could not exist long without the center of its administration, or the bureaucrats and nobles needed to staff it. Without any decisive action, there would have to be peace. Amnesty for the rebels was agreed upon, but the Queen demanded one key concession. All laws passed against Cardinal Mazarin must be rescinded. In spite of the role his infamous and profligate reputation had played in inciting the rebels, she remained loyal to her minister, just as he remained to her. At last, in August of 1649, to great cheering crowds, the king and his regents returned to Paris. But would this peace last? Mazarin had always expressed the belief that private ambitions, rather than public affairs, had motivated the key leaders of the Fronde, and the next years of turmoil were to give proof to his thesis, even if he had been mistaken before. The great Condé, the victorious prince who had forced the settlement between Paris and the king, was now unarguably the single most powerful man in France, and he insisted on using this strength to have a say in the affairs of the crown. He demanded, and received, an agreement from Mazarin personally, that he would never decide any matter concerning the state without Condé's approval, and Condé even elbowed his way into the question of to whom Mazarin married his nieces. Being French, Condé did his best to make public appearances with the Queen very uncomfortable, at one point even encouraging one of his officers to write the Queen love letters. The remainder of that year passed in an array of court ceremonies, dances, and royal visits, but behind these seemingly indulgent entertainments and receptions was in fact a quiet struggle between Condé and the Queen, and Mazarin with her. Condé looked to his fellow nobles for quiet allies who supported his influence at court. The Prince Conti, who is his brother, and their brother-in-law, the Duke of Longueville. The three noblemen would visit court together one morning on January 18, 1650. They were greeted by the young king, now 11 years old, who told them, Maman says we should go to the gallery. Stepping together into that room, the three were confronted by a detachment of the royal guard, which summarily arrested them and packed them all off to prison outside of Paris. Louis, as the years had passed, was growing up, and growing an understanding of his shaky place in the balance of what was called his kingdom. With the help of his mother and her advisors, he was growing into a cool, confident youth, augmenting the charm he already displayed from a young age. His personality and his personal presence would play a key role in the attempts of the court to reassert itself. Though Paris was pacified and Prince Condé locked away, for now, the provinces were still disobedient, withholding their taxes and turning away royal agents. Young Louis was the key to all this. The Queen and Mazarin used his presence essentially as a charm offensive, spending most of 1650 visiting provincial cities where the king's popularity allowed for the resumption of royal control. Visits to the leading magistrates, public demonstrations of royal status through ceremony, and the emphasis on the personal appearance of the king typified these visits. The king's popularity was such that one diarist proclaimed that the queen could conquer the whole universe simply by displaying him. In spite of this popular enthusiasm for the king himself, the popularity of the government remained low, and Mazarin and other officials were still loathed. By February of 1651, agitation against Mazarin had again reached a boiling point. The government was compelled to let Condé and his supporters back out of prison, and after delivering instructions to this effect, Mazarin took the proactive step of exiling himself to Germany. In this climate, Gaston of Orleans, one of Queen Anne's co-regents, now asserted his own position with the support of Condé. He demanded the calling of the Estates General, and held the rest of the court nearly captive through his authority as Lieutenant General of the kingdom and the head of the War Council, powers which gave him authority over, for instance, the Paris militia, whose guard posts he moved to be nearly next to those of the royal guard in the palace. Gaston's main fear at this time was that the Queen and her son would flee the capital again, and he resorted to extraordinary means to ensure this would not happen. The commander of the mercenary Swiss guards was sent to draw the curtains of the king's bed every night to ensure he was still present. The city was restive too, and the queen was compelled to permit common Parisians to intrude on the king's bedchamber to see him sleeping there for themselves. These were humiliations neither Anne nor young Louis would ever forget. From afar, the loyal but hated Mazarin continued to correspond with the queen. He saw things very clearly. The court was in captivity, and only military victory could restore its power, and he intended to raise an army of foreign mercenaries to reimpose order. This last resort was only averted by the efforts of Queen Anne to align herself to Prince Condé, whose influence grew greater every day in Paris. Far from the prison he had occupied just months before, Condé made public appearances, reverenced the relics of Paris's patron saint, Saint Genevieve, during processions, and augmented his power at court, with several of his clients being appointed to important offices. His influence and his rapprochement with the queen politically, however, did not signify any lessening of his ambition, and he thoughtlessly slighted the king when it pleased him to do so. On one occasion, when Louis was returning by carriage from a trip to swim in the Seine, Prince Condé refused to step down from his own carriage, essentially refusing to recognize the royal presence. Louis was infuriated and later remarked that if his guard had been there, he would have attacked the prince's entourage himself. On September 7, 1651, Louis XIV turned 13, and in a lavish ceremony had his coming of age, complete with a solemn appearance before the Parliament of Paris, an affair called the Bed of Justice, or Lit de Justice. Louis made his speech before his erstwhile enemies without a hitch. So far had he come from being the strained and nervous boy who had teared up in the middle of a speech before the Parliament just 3 years before. Prince Condé, however, was not present to hear it. He had fled the city on expectation of being arrested again, and by the 22nd he arrived in Bordeaux. There he began to take tax revenues for himself and to raise soldiers. Though he was not yet declared a rebel, the king's party proved incapable of preventing him from recruiting an army, and France was again to be subjected to civil war due to the power of an overmighty aristocrat. Unlike the dispute with the parliaments, this phase of the Fronde actually resulted in open warfare between the rival parties. Though it is referred to as the Fronde of the Princes, it should still be understood in continuity with the earlier period. The same grievances were utilized by the rebellious nobles as had been voiced by the parliaments a few years before. The corruption of Mazarin, agitation for the Estates General, and the depredations of tax farmers and financiers. But now these complaints were used as a lever for the ambitions of individuals like Condé, rather than to attempt a radical change in the form of government. By this time, the king was now old enough to be more of an active player, and he and the court set out with an army to put Condé down in September. The king played a canny double game at the same time. He outlawed Mazarin, much to the exiled cardinal's horror, but in secret signed orders for him to return. Cardinal entered France again in the winter with several skilled generals who were his clients, and, most importantly, an army of 4,000 men, but the price of Mazarin's service was to be reviled by much of the rest of the country, and the court and the king, who had taken the field to prepare to hunt Condé down, now found itself shut out of the provincial cities, forced to stay in the town of Poitiers until hunger compelled them to try Blois. The court was refused entry. The castle of Guines on the banks of the Loire was its next refuge, where it arrived in April of 1652, and it was here that the court learned that far from chasing Condé down, he was coming to them, he and 15,000 new friends, compared with the 12,000 in the service of the court. For the past 6 months, Condé had been attempting to secure as much of the south of France for himself as he could take, but the loyal General d'Auquincourt had done his best to spoil his efforts. Now Prince Condé struck at the head, and while the king and his mother were at Guines, managed to ambush the royal army not far away, near the town of Blenheau. Condé destroyed much of the royal army and for a moment was within a hair's breadth of capturing the king himself, but for the actions of one man. Henri, Viscount of Turenne, commanded a smaller part of the royal forces, just 4,000 men in total, and some miles away. But when he heard of the battle which had taken place during the night, he rushed his forces to engage Condé, heedless of the difference in strength, and forced the prince to withdraw. The king had escaped again. Meanwhile, Paris had turned from Louis's court, partly out of disgust for Mazarin, and with the traitorous Gaston of Orleans to encourage them, shut its gates to the king. Hatred of Mazarin was so intense that Gaston claimed he and Condé would both lay down their arms if only he would be exiled again, while the Parliament of Paris went as far as seizing and auctioning off his library in order to finance a bounty for the cardinal's assassination. The city readied itself for a battle, and Condé entered Paris on April 11th, with the king and his armies not far behind him. Paris was again besieged, but the king had charitably permitted deliveries of bread to be made to ensure the health of the populace, guarded by his own troops. These were attacked, and the frondeurs claimed that the bread was poisoned, all while Condé was speaking in Parliament, as if he possessed royal authority. The time had come for the king and his party to force a decision. After a month of siege, royal forces managed to trap a force under Condé, which contained both Paris militiamen and Spanish soldiers, against the walls of Paris near the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. In a decisive moment, Gaston of Orleans sent his own daughter to the Bastille with orders to turn the guns of that fortress on the royalists, and caused heavy casualties as Condé retired into the city. The court was forced to retreat to Compiègne. Condé, however, made poor use of this victory, and rather than pursuing the fugitive king, used his troops to coup the city government in Paris, and was declared commander-in-chief, while Gaston was confirmed as lieutenant general. Under these auspices, in July, the Parliament of Paris declared that the king was in fact Mazarin's captive, and Gaston of Orleans began to agitate for the other cities of France to form a league solely for the purpose of being rid of the cardinal. By this stage, the turmoil in France had become pervasive. Father Vincent de Paul, a famous diarist of the time, wrote that Paris was packed with the rural poor, who had no choice but to seek safety inside the walls to be safe from the marauding soldiers of both sides, and that troops routinely pilfered the sacred vessels of churches, burned villages, and raped nuns. This chaos, compounded by Prince Condé's inaction and the violence of his subordinates, finally turned opinion against him. Judges within Paris wrote letters begging for the return of the king, and surly crowds were heard to chant, "Long live the king and peace, down with the princes." Mazarin had the good sense to return himself to exile, removing another bone of contention. By October, an assembly of the colonels of the Paris militia confronted Gaston of Orleans and demanded that the king be permitted entry. These soldiers, who had been the supporters of the Frond from the beginning, now saw it was pointless to go on. On October 21st, the 14-year-old King Louis XIV returned to his capital in triumph, no longer riding in his mother's carriage as when he was only a boy, but now riding at the head of his own guard. The city was full of cheering crowds. The Fronde was over. Not long after, Gaston of Orleans left for Blois, the capital of the territory he received as part of his pardon. If he had been of a mind to resist, things might have been much more difficult for the king, and there was little he could do with popular unrest subsiding. Condé would go into exile and serve France's enemy Spain as a general, until peace was finally concluded in the 1660s. Mazarin would eventually return to France and continue his faithful, though uneven, career of service until his death. Louis summoned the Parliament on October 22nd for the ceremony of the Lit de Justice, and rather than going to its chamber in the center of the city, he called it to attend upon him in the palace of the Louvre. The king granted mercy, and personally tore up the records of the last 5 years of the Parliament's actions, so as to destroy the official memory of them. But it was forbidden from discussing politics or finance, and many of its leaders were still exiled. The city at last submitted to the king, and now he would rule. What would the story of France have been if Louis had failed, if the court had submitted to the Frondeurs? In the earliest phases, it seemed as if a near-republican sentiment had taken hold of Paris, but the king himself remained popular. Perhaps the parliaments would have enforced conditions on the king's rule, but even then the Parliament of Paris was not a representative body of the whole nation like the Parliament in England claimed to be. The social tenor of the Fronde was still conservative, and there were never the kinds of social upheaval which typified the later revolution in 1789. More likely is that France would have become more decentralized, with more power resting in the hands of noblemen like Condé. But Louis had other plans. On February 23, 1654, the court celebrated victory with dance. Louis himself took the leading role. In the midst of his court, and to the sound of drums and orchestra, the king took his place on stage, clothed as Apollo, the sun god, and accompanied by dancers representing honor, victory, valor, and fame, he vanquished the serpent rebellion. The Sun King was the name that Louis would take into history, and in the rest of his reign after this point he did everything in his power to realize that title. The court would never again be subjected to the riots of Parisian crowds. The king built a marvelous new palace at Versailles, the splendor of which exceeded anything known in Europe. No longer would the throne be a bauble traded between rival princes. By the end of Louis's reign, the nobility of France would be reduced to utter docility. In day-to-day ritual, the harrowing experience of the king's bedchamber being invaded by the citizens of Paris was inverted. Every morning, courtiers would compete to be by the king's side, to put on the king's shirt, to help him with his coat, to offer him his shoes. Nobles who busied themselves hurrying to do him favors were not able to be in the countryside plotting against him, and Louis's reign now marked a new turn in the history of France, where a year-round presence at the court would be the mark of high favor, rather than the active administration of large territories. If someone came to the king to ask a favor and he was not resident at Versailles, the king would turn him away with a word to his chamberlain: "We never see him." A lot of people speak of the court life of Louis XIV as an array of curiosities, as if it catered to the obscure tastes of a fabulously wealthy and completely insane narcissist. The truth is that every levée or rising that the king held, he was enforcing his guiding, dominating will on his subjects with ritual, ceremonially reinforcing that he, Louis, was alone king. And alone it was to be. After the death of Cardinal Mazarin years after the Fronde, the king announced to the Parliament that he would rule for himself and by himself. There were to be no ministers, no councils, no estates generals or parlement that would make shadows from the rays of the sun. If any king could make the claim, Louis XIV was the absolute monarch.